And these are really fantastic ways to dive in. And in those cases, it's very much a do-it-yourself, DIY kind of experience. More so, especially if you go into the miniature wargaming end of things. And there are Star Wars miniature war games. There are all kinds of different ones where you go and you can purchase, or you could 3D print materials, and then you paint them and you put them on bases, and then you create terrain to play with them in. And it's really an extension of this hobby and therefore of your fandom involvement in any of these kinds of games. Where do you find this stuff, aside from the stuff that you're going to create? Much as I love analog things, the first place I'm going to point you is the interwebses. We loves the interwebses, my precious. Obviously, you could do a Google search for your particular fandom. You may have to narrow it down a bit if you're going for Marvel or DC, but you could easily type in, for instance, Spider-Man games. You could type in Spider-Man board games, card games. I don't know if there are any war games, HeroClix maybe. You could type in Spider-Man Marvel role-playing games. There are several out there at the moment. In fact, one I know by Matt Forbeck, an old game designer acquaintance of mine, is still in playtesting, I believe, and is coming out. You could Google search it. If you must, you can go onto Amazon to see what is available. But the most helpful online tool I'm going to give you, I'd tell you to write it down, but it's fairly easy to remember, is called Board Game Geek. And some of you already know it, and kudos to you. BoardGameGeek.com can help you explore everything about many different games, including role-playing games, board games, war games even, ancient war games, back from the dawn of role-playing. That's a great search engine for you to type in whatever particular fandom you're in at the moment and see what comes up. You may have to narrow the field a little bit, as you're going to have to with any kind of search, but you will get some idea of what's out there. And with each of those games, you will get reviews, you'll get additional freebies or player aids that people want to post online. You'll get some pictures of the components, because some of these games are not cheap. The card games are usually fairly cheap, but you get into a nice role-playing game, you're going to want to get all the goodies for that. And dice, you can never have enough dice. And then board games can start getting pricey too. If you get anything with a collectible component, including something like the Star Wars X-Wing game, where you just want to keep buying more ships to augment your forces, you're going to start dropping a pretty penny. So before you jump into a game, you're going to want to do some research. See if the gameplay is right for you, if it's something you really want to get into. Game conventions and fan conventions, usually like this, are a good place if they have a gaming track to sort of come along and say, hey, I've heard about this game, I want to give it a try, someone's running it. It's always nicer to play with someone else's toys. So those are good recommendations to check out on BoardGameGeek.com. You really want to look into these both there and, of course, in person. Now, we don't have a whole lot of gaming or fan conventions here in Culpeper County. There are probably some in the Metro DC area. I know of a few wargaming conventions down the peninsula, down by Williamsburg and Newport News. But for the most part, there aren't a lot of places that you can physically go and face-to-face interact with people who know about this stuff. But I'm going to recommend two to you that are about half an hour and a 60-minute drive from here, if I can. I'm assuming I can do this kind of promotion. I don't work for either place, but if you go up to Warrenton, in the shopping center at the north end of town where Joann's and Staples is, there is the game store, I think it's called. You know a very good game store when you walk in and half the store is a store, and the other half is a bunch of empty tables, preferably not empty, but preferably filled with gamers. And they are playing all kinds of cool games. Those are a great place to browse. I know we say we browse the internet, we look around, but sometimes nothing beats being able to go to the library or to an actual physical store and just kind of wander around and see what the titles are and see if there's something there that really grabs your attention, that you could pick up right there and kind of flip through or read the back of the box or whatever it is you're going to do. And game stores, like the one up in Warrenton, are fantastic for doing that. The other place I'll recommend is out in Fredericksburg off of Route 3, in the same shopping center as Planet Fitness. It's called Your Hobby Place. They also have a beautiful selection of different kinds of games, a lot of historical, a lot of Warhammer, and as well as a huge area in the back to play. At these, and I'm sure wherever you go, you will be able to find a game store somewhere within a decent amount of a drive where you can check the games out firsthand. You can browse the shelves to see if there's something that you're interested in. You can ask the folks who run the store, hey, what do you think of this game? You can look that up on BoardGameGeek.com and see what do the reviews say about this? What are some of them, they talk about the actual game rules or the components, what do they look like? Sometimes there are people there who are playing, if not that game, other games, and goodness knows, I'm sure those people have plenty of opinions about whatever game you happen to ask them about. Because I know you don't have many opinions, but gamers usually do have pretty strident opinions about what they like. Those are two fantastic places you can go to further immerse yourself and face-to-face with other people who share not only your interest in games, but your interest in your particular fandom. They're also a great place to find more players. Or try a game. You don't want to necessarily buy it, someone's running it. Sometimes they have demo weekends or demo events. Goodness knows, I know the two stores I just mentioned have plenty of Magic the Gathering and Pokemon events and Warhammer events and historical war game events. So take your pick. There's plenty to do in the gaming field. Now, I think I've covered most everything. I've made my two recommendations. So I think we're doing okay time-wise, so I guess if you want to set up for Q&As, we can start with Q&As. I know we've got a few latecomers, but if you have any questions, if there's something I've missed, I think I've covered everything. There's one more thing, though, looking at the Star Wars game, that I want to touch on. When we used to write and edit and produce material for this game, we used to have a saying. This wasn't ours. What we wrote for this was contractually not ours. It belonged at the time to George. Now it belongs to Mickey Mouse. But it's not what we create for this and publish professionally, I'll add, is not ours. And the people who make these games are, of course, professional publishers and game designers. And they're working in a business. So there may be, if you're into a fandom and there's no game that you know of for this, there may be a reason for that. Maybe someone hasn't picked it up. Companies are licensees. They pay for the privilege of producing these games. So maybe someone hasn't decided to pick up your particular fandom for a game. You could always make up your own stuff if you are so inclined or feel talented. Or you could, see if there's a company out there you could write to, say, hey, we'd love to have this particular game. But companies that own the IPs, these companies with these transmedia properties, know that games are one of those medias you enjoy. And so they're always looking for business opportunities to find somebody to say, give us some money, and you can make some money, and we'll make some money, and we'll produce some cool games based on our particular intellectual property.
They pay to license them, pretty much.
These are licensed games.
So in order for that company to make that, they had to get permission from Lucasfilm.
Do you really want me to go into that? I'll go into that. Having worked on this for 5 years, I basically ran a quarterly publication called the Star Wars Adventure Journal, which unlike books are books, and we produce 2 books a month, which is pretty crazy even for the mid-90s for production. And you know why we did it? There was a fan base out there. There were some people who never played the game, and they bought every single one of the books we produced because they're fans. And the games that we had great people use them in their books and some of their other media. Now that, of course, a lot of that continuity, as we call it, was wiped away when Disney acquired Lucasfilm, and I understand that.
Yes, I definitely do too.
You need when you're bringing Star Wars from a couple of movies to a couple more movies, a huge number of novels, and then streaming stuff, you don't want to constrain those writers. And some of you may have heard of the Lucas Story Group. I don't know if they still call it that. They are the guys who are in charge of looking over the continuity for everything that's still coming out. But to produce something like this, there was a long, long approvals process with proposals and concept art. And I don't even want to think about what it means for a game with components like board games. But someone would have to read through everything. Is this in the spirit of Star Wars? Is this in the spirit of the license? Can we do this? At this time, couldn't play Imperial characters. It was a bit too dark, we were told. So, hands off. The people in the license want to look over that. I'll give you another brief story. West End Games did a number of licensed role-playing games, including one for Hercules and Xena, Men in Black, Indiana Jones, and I'm sure I'm missing a couple. One of the fellows on our staff loved the X-Files. It's the mid-90s. X-Files is all the rage. Wouldn't it be great to do an X-Files game? And initial talks were started with Fox and Chris Carter. And one of the reasons that West End backed away from it was the approvals process, because Chris Carter, being the producer and the real creative genius behind the X-Files, wanted to review everything we proposed to make for the game. He is a busy guy. And that would have put in a huge production backlog in making this. And that reminds me, too, not so much about these days where we have a new Marvel movie coming out, goodness knows how often, or new Star Wars stuff coming out very, very frequently. There was a time, goodness, at the end of the 80s where kids did not know who Darth Vader was. I know it's hard to imagine, but kids did not know who that was. There were comic books. There hadn't been a movie since 1982. And so we had this sort of dearth of anything, and things like the role-playing game helped bring that back. But these days, there's so much media that comes out. But if you see the new hotness that comes out, whatever that may be, it may be a little while before you start seeing merchandising coming out for that, whether they're action figures or games based on that. Intellectual property companies are a bit more savvy these days about those developments. But it can take a while. You know, imagine what goes into creating some of these games, with a board game, a card game, a role-playing game, in terms of the creative staff, figuring out the rules, play testing the rules. Goodness knows, you have to play test the rules or you're going to get it to production and see like, oh, this mechanic doesn't work. Nobody is winning the game. So it takes a while to get through that process. So when you do get into a new fandom that is brand new, the new hotness, it might take a while. And that's where certainly you're welcome to make up your own. Just don't sell it. But certainly you can have, just like you can have your own adventures with the action figures, you can certainly figure out how to do it. If you're especially into role-playing games or other kinds of games, you can figure out how to do this for yourself. Or find a setting neutral game that you like that you can adapt to that. Or as we say, reskin. I mean, goodness knows, how many times have we reskinned Monopoly into Star Wars and Marvel, and goodness knows how, and Culpeper. There are some games. Risk, I'll tell you, is, I don't like Risk. It's what I call, it's one of those infamous table flipping games where inevitably one person is winning and everybody else is losing, and someone loses their cool, and either that or they chuck the dice. The dice chucking games are great. And all the pieces go out. But I've seen Risk reskinned things like the Clone Wars. And they make some subtle changes with some of the mechanics that we're familiar with in Risk that really work with the setting, that really work with our fandom, and make it a far better game than it originally was. If they can do it, so can you. I think I've covered on everything, so I'm going to invite anybody who has a question about licensed games, board games, involving and engaging your fandom with games, to step up to the mic, don't be shy, and ask a question. Come on down.
Yeah, I just had a question. There used to be a game some time ago. It was called Heroescape, and they had a Marvel expansion pack, and they were planning a Star Wars expansion pack, but it never took off like they wanted to, and it just got discontinued. Like, is there anywhere that stuff would still be available other than overpriced eBay or something like that?
eBay, well, there are places you can look for these things that are out of print, and many of these games are out of print. This particular Star Wars is out of print, this version. You could look at eBay. There are a few online game dealers who deal in used games, and in fact, if you don't like your old used games, you could trade them in for cash or credit. There are two Wayne's Books online is more for role-playing game books, but they do have some board games. And Noble Knight Games covers everything. And I'll tell you, you're not always going to get non-collector prices, but you have a better chance of finding it there, and it's a little bit easier than doing the tag sale crawl. That said, if you find a convention that's a game convention that has a flea market, that is also a good place to look for these sorts of things. What's one person's trash is another person's treasure, and that goes for both in person and online. So those are places that you can look, but keep your eyes open for stuff. If there's something that you really love and it came out 20 years ago, keep looking. Someone's got it out there. Someone's got it on a shelf. Someone's got it in a basement. Someone's relative who unfortunately just passed away. It's in a pile of junk somewhere waiting to be brought to Goodwill. The Goodwill type of stores, the thrift stores, are great places to look. Sometimes I've had luck, sometimes I've not. If you're willing to do that kind of a physical crawl around, those are good places to find these things. Your question also brings up an interesting comment, is these things come and these things can very quickly go. More so with regular games of these kinds, the licensed games tend to stick around well after the license is wrapped up, or better yet, the license keeps going. Marvel, DC, Star Wars, Tolkien, Middle-earth. But there are some that go out, and I think that's an interesting aspect of fandom that we all have to deal with at some point, is the disappointment in what happens to our favorite properties. Did the latest installment of an online series kind of disappoint us? Did it go away altogether? Goodness knows how many Firefly fans are out there who still, it's gone. How long did the original Trek fans stick around until Star Trek The Next Generation came along? And then a whole bunch of different series and games. Goodness knows, there's Star Trek Attack Wing, which is very much like Star Wars X-Wing. So disappointment, I'm sad to say, is something that we all have to deal with, both as fans and gamers, as well as just general humans. It's difficult when we channel our enthusiasm and engage with a fandom so much, and then kind of have the official nature of that sort of peter out. That doesn't mean we can't still enjoy them, and these are great because, how many times have you been on the internet and, wow, that great site, where'd that site go? That site is gone. It's 404. It's not there anymore. The guy who was doing it doesn't update it anymore. It's gone away. One of the nice things about analog is as long as you got it, short of natural disasters or other things, you've got it. You can always just pull it out, dust it off, relearn the rules, play it around, whether it's next week or 5 years from now. It's there. Other questions? Step on up.
This is more cultural, larger. How has the COVID pandemic affected gaming? Has it been a benefit, a detriment? I know already I had a friend who got back into D&D, I think, just before COVID, and it seems to be a huge D&D renaissance right now. Has that been the same way with other forms and other games because of COVID, or what do you think?
That's a really fantastic question. Yeah. How do we as humans adapt? And this gets more complex the more specialized you get. It's one thing to adapt, well, how do I find my food? You're not going out and killing it, you're going down to the supermarket. Or during the pandemic, you're calling up and placing an order for pickup or delivery. But how do we engage in this inherently social experience when we're supposed to be isolating or masking and keeping our distance? And I think for all aspects of our society, we've had to adapt. And that's proven its challenges with something as tactile as analog games, as community-based as these games. As much as we sometimes worry about the internet really helped a lot of people. Certainly with role-playing games where you have different chat groups or roll D20 or something, where you can meet in a virtual space and interact. And what's nice about role-playing games is most of that takes place communicating to each other. You don't necessarily have to worry about moving figures or roll. You can roll dice if you want. You can even get electronic die rollers. So going on the internet has helped with that. There are some computer and internet modules that allow you to play games in real time against real opponents online. The one that comes to mind is called Vassal, and it is primarily for board war games. But there are other ways that we adapt to that. Getting together was not always easy to do. There is a genre of game called the solitaire game. And they are fantastic games to play online, or to play on your own, excuse me. Anything that's generally a cooperative game, and the ones that come to mind are certainly, ironically enough, Pandemic. But there's a whole library of solitaire games that people can indulge in, and they cover everything from card games to board games to war games. There are even some fantastic solitaire role-playing games. One that just released is called Ironsworn Starforged, which is based on the Ironsworn medieval role-playing game that's solitaire, and this one is for science fiction adventures, off in space, off on your own. And there are rules to help you guide yourself in creating your own stories. How do I create a character? How do I adapt to that? Where do I go? What are my missions? What are the things that I swear to uphold? So I think solitaire gaming found a new renaissance, as well as online gaming. There are some people who have been really into games, and the pandemic means that they can't go out and engage face-to-face. They can't go out to their local game stores and see what's new and spend a little money buying what they need for their thing. And I think in this case, there are some people who had some extra money, especially when they're not going out to eat, going out for vacations, or doing those other things. They say, well, how do I stay involved and stay engaged on my own? And a lot of these games, you play solitaire, certainly with role-playing games and miniatures games, you are engaging in creative aspects of the hobby that are not actually playing the game. So people, I'm sure, went online with some spare cash and indulged a little bit for that time, hopefully today, when you can get back out there and engage in your hobby face-to-face. Have I covered everything for that adequately enough?
I think so. I was just wondering.
Yeah.
I think it's been kind of a big explosion in gaming. The game has like increased a huge amount in the last.
It has, and
It's huge.
the pandemic aside, I think one of the things that certainly has done that has been the production ability, certainly for what I'll call film, but encompasses videos. There was a time going back to, who was that Darth Vader guy again at the early 80s? There was a time where I would have loved to have had a weekly Star Wars TV show, preferably Saturday morning cartoons. I'm that old. We have that. We have that for all of the wonderful geeky things we get into, whether it's new movies every 6 months or a new streaming series every couple of months. And if we didn't like that one particular one we didn't care for, there's a new one coming down the pipe. So there's plenty of stuff. The production, the technology has allowed media intellectual property owners to create, has really, I don't want to quite say flooded the market, but has really been able to satisfy us and satisfy a lot of different things. For instance, I don't care very much for things with zombies in them. Zombies are just not my thing. So I pass up on The Walking Dead and other things. But goodness knows, there's plenty of other stuff that caters to my interests. And I think content producers understand that. It certainly is driven by our capitalistic model of economy. So we want to get engaged in that. And there is something more. And as part of that, more and more people are turning to all this transmedia material. So you start off with the movie or the book, you go on to the graphic novel, you buy the soundtracks, and then you get into the games. And once you get into the games, that can be a whole Pandora's box of, you just pick one. Goodness knows I have enough Star Wars X-Wing ships to last a while. No Death Star. I want to say there is actually, the folks who made the X-Wing game have done an Armada game, and I think the regular Star Destroyers are about that big. And someone at the company thought, well, if we're going to do a regular Star Destroyer, we have to do the Super Star Destroyer. And I think the Super Star Destroyer actually dominates the table. It just sits there. It's a couple of feet long. I don't have it. I've heard it's a beautiful model, but the scale issues when you start moving toward Death Star kind of get a little out of hand. Any other questions? Please, I'm happy to engage. Go ahead. I am here, so engage me, please.
Everyone talks about Star Wars and Star Trek. What's out there for the folks who likes Battlestar Galactica?
Battlestar Galactica. There is, unsurprisingly, a game very much like X-Wing. I believe it's put out by the Italian company Nexus, I think is what they're called. So you can get these wonderful pre-painted, for those of you who don't like to paint really tiny things, they're pre-painted models for these kinds of games. They're fantastic. And you can set up different scenarios for that, for Battlestar Galactica. There's a great Battlestar Galactica board game. There is not a lot, certainly, goodness, thinking about when did that series come out? What, early? The original? The newer ones. Mid-aughts? Mid-2000s, early 2000s? And I think aside from the miniatures game, there has not been a lot coming out. That's a very good example of a property that had a lot of media presence. It had a lot of fan presence. I'm sure there were comic books and other things that came out with it. I know I've got at least one soundtrack for that. And then it's sort of, you have diehard fans, and they're still going to have those games, and they will snatch up whatever is released for that. But getting your fix on something new is going to be a little bit more difficult for something like that.
Yeah, and a lot of times there might be a huge gap between new things. Like for Star Wars, after the Jedi, there wasn't really anything for 16 years, and a huge renaissance with the prequels, even though everyone hated the prequels, including myself. And it came back again with the Clone Wars series and stuff like that, and the sequel trilogy. Yeah, things come and go, and they eventually get comebacks, whether they're good or not.
This brings up an interesting story. Star Wars is one of the things that I've loved most of my life. This will bring up an interesting story about that sort of lapse in material and how it can come back. When West End Games came out with the Star Wars role-playing game in '87, it was, who's Darth Vader? Very few people knew. It had been, what, 82, 83 since Jedi came out? And, people, back then, before we had overwhelming merchandising, it was like, okay, there were movies, we're done. We don't have a huge fan community in society at that point. So we muddle on through the rest of the '80s without any new media from Star Wars, except for maybe a couple of novels, and then they die out, and the Marvel Star Wars comics, which some of us really enjoyed. But really, that had to sustain everybody, all these other Star Wars fans, and eventually people go on to do other things or grow up, or I hate to think grow up, and engage in other aspects of life. When West End started producing this, Bantam Books got the license from Lucasfilm to do original novels. And they sent them several different names of authors to do it. A fellow named Timothy Zahn was picked to start a new series of novels set in the New Republic after Return of the Jedi. And so he starts writing, he's like, oh gosh, I gotta, what do I have to do? And so someone from West End sends him a box of everything that West End had produced at the time, which was a pretty heavy box. And he's like, oh gosh, these people have been making all this stuff. And this is continuity. Lucasfilm considers this not quite canon as the films, but canon for the universe. Part of the continuity. So he's like, oh, I have to read all this stuff. But as he starts reading, he comes to a realization, wow, this starship, I needed to invent a starship over here for something, but they've already done that, so I can use theirs. And I need a planet for this, but they've already got a planet. That's fantastic. It's not from the movies, but it's here. Lucasfilm has approved it, so he also doesn't have to worry about making something up that Lucasfilm may or may not approve. They've already proved it. It's in this book. We can point to it. Timothy Zahn's Heir to the Empire trilogy of novels is credited with helping to bring back a resurgence of interest in Star Wars. This is what's so great about transmedia. We start off with a film. All right, it fades off. We have a role-playing game. Wow, it hits, and then only gamers are going to play that. Then we start getting a novel. And the novel came along just in time to tap all those kids who were Star Wars fans back then, who are now a bit older and want to sit down for a novel. And then Dark Horse Comics starts coming out with comic book series. And then there are other games, there are collectible card games. Goodness, I've forgotten how many different card games there are. That's a great way for something like Star Wars, which someone at West End Games, the marketing director, the sales director, said Star Wars is a dead license. Nobody wants Star Wars. This was, what, 87, 88, 89? And how much has that changed between media and everything else? It really has. It has changed a great deal.
Just because there hasn't been new Star Wars media in a long time doesn't mean that it's inactive. Just because there was a 16-year gap between really Jedi and the Phantom Menace, doesn't mean the franchise was dead. There were still other media coming forward, just not the movies. The same went between this 10-year between Revenge of the Sith and The Force Awakens. There were still new Star Wars stuff coming, even if it wasn't the movies. And once again, there were the Clone Wars and the other animated shows.
And I think that brings up a point about fandom. We love what we love. And it takes a lot to alienate us from things that we really invest ourselves in, whether it's watching all the episodes or all the movies or buying all the merchandise. When something like that goes away or subsides for a short while, we kind of go, well, maybe we're still carrying the torch, and sometimes we go into hibernation. And I think with fandom, it's great to be able to pick up where we left off and re-engage. And sometimes, like I said, some of us don't like certain of the other Star Wars movies or didn't enjoy them as much. Some of us don't like some of the other media that falls under the umbrella of Star Wars. That comic book series wasn't my thing, but I love this comic book series. Whether it's streaming, some of the streaming stuff I think is great. Some of it has its flaws. I think that's one of the neat things about fandom. There are many aspects of it, and I think what I really enjoy is when I can engage with folks with any aspect, but particularly games, and have a really positive interaction with that as we enjoy, really, all these things that we've come to be a part of our lives. Any other questions? I probably have time for one more. Anybody? Anybody? Good. I was about to say Bueller. Thank you.
So, in the licensed kind of stuff, do you come with like something already written in a universe thing to like the X-Files to like see like, hey, here's what we can do? Or do you say, here's all the other stuff we've done, we could do something in your universe?
That's a very good question. It is not easy to break into licensed work. Usually you start off with a company that produces stuff. So you're right. You do go to someone, and West End, in fact, did go with a very popular game called Paranoia, about a darkly humorous future, because the computer is your friend. Trust the computer. You do go ahead and say, look, these are the games we've done. Sometimes you're lucky enough to have a stable of licensed material, but it establishes you as a professional publisher, and that you've done really the quality of your work that vouches for it. Not always do intellectual property license owners approach other companies. Usually the companies want to make money. They will approach the IP holders, the licensees, or the licensors rather. So you do create a proposal. Now, you don't want to invest too much time and say, hey, look, here's the 500-page game we just created, because what if they say no? Which is a good point. What if they say no? You reskin the rules. You take those concepts and you put them towards something that can make that company profitable, whether it's an intellectual property or not. But yes, that is something that you companies will do. Fans do not always do that. That said, I saw some great Star Trek: The Next Generation role-playing game rules before anybody even thought of doing that. A bunch of fans did it, brought it down to Kinko's, had it copied, gave it out to their friends. You can't sell it. It might get you the attention of a company that does produce such games. These days, that's getting into a long shot. I have seen fan-produced games that file off the serial numbers, like the game about a magical school for witches who ride brooms. A game about pulp adventurers looking for treasure and punching Nazis. Nothing like, you can't say Indiana Jones, but you can. Nobody has a copyright on a genre or a style like that. Occasionally there are ones that are clear parodies, but those really don't get a lot of traction. But yes, it is a very involved business and legal proposition to do anything like this. And there are companies, you know, our company had a legal guy. There are bigger companies that have a whole legal department that do nothing but this sort of thing. And they figure out the royalties and contract work and who are they paying and then you've got the creatives who have editorial and development, project managers, production managers. And who are we going to get to do this? Do we design this in-house? Do we get some freelancers? You know, who gets all the, well, we know who gets all the rights, is the intellectual property owner gets all the rights. It is a very, you know, any one of these things, there's an awful lot of business background that goes into this, and negotiation and approvals to make sure that not only the details of the game fit with the existing universe, but that the feel of the game works out. Any other questions? I appreciate you guys all coming and hearing me go on for so long about games. If you have any questions afterwards or anything that occurs to you, come up while I'm packing up. As I mentioned earlier, at 2:45 in the conference room at the back of the library, I will be running Hungry Orcs, which is a war game using huge miniatures. Can I say that? If you are into Middle-earth, or if you are interested in just learning about how a miniature war game works. All right. Thank you very much.